Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremy Bennett, VACo Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, and it is my distinct privilege to welcome you to our 11 a.m. breakout session on the future of education. Many counties have seen distinct challenges to education and childcare brought on by COVID-19. This session is intended to share analysis and discussion of educational issues from early childhood, K-12, and higher education perspectives as county governments continue to support the well-being and development of children and students within their communities from birth to adulthood. VACo is honored to be joined today by three experts in their fields. First up, we have Dr. Deborah Bergeron, who serves as the director of the Office of Head Start. She has spent 3 decades in pre-K-12 public education as a classroom teacher and elementary and high school administrator. In the course of her career, Dr. Bergeron also started, grew, and ultimately sold her own educational services company. Dr. Bergeron will be followed by longtime VACo friend and collaborator, Dr. Keith Perrigan, who currently serves as Superintendent of Bristol, Virginia Public Schools and President of the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools of Virginia. Closing out our presentation, we have Mr. Mark Owczarski, Assistant Vice President for University Relations at Virginia Tech. A 15-year veteran of tech, in his current role, he provides overall support in the areas of university spokesperson, college and unit-based communications, and crisis communications. Welcome to you all. Before I turn things over to Dr. Bergeron, I just want to make a quick couple of housekeeping notes. We will have a Q&A portion of the program after the 3 presentations. However, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat feature, or if you've called in, to unmute your phone using *6. With that, I'll turn things over to Dr. Bergeron. Welcome, Doctor, and I'm so glad you could be with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I remember I think the last time we were together, it was a national conference, if that's correct. We ran into each other and thought we should get together in Virginia. So this is great stuff, and I'm thrilled to be here. Very happy to be with a fellow Hokie. I didn't go to Virginia Tech, but lots of my money did. So my kids are Hokies, so I love that. But it is a really good time to get together, and this trajectory, this sort of birth to college trajectory that we all think about is an important one. I think one of the most important things is that we think of it as one long journey rather than these siloed experiences that kids have. And I think if we can get in that mindset, we can make a lot of progress, even during a tough time like this COVID crisis that really took us all by surprise last year. And I don't know about you, but I kept planning 1 month at a time, thinking certainly in a month we'll be able to. And then I stopped doing that around May and figured we better start long-term thinking about really long-term, what are we going to do? And for those of you who might not be aware, Head Start and Early Head Start serves pregnant moms, children birth to 5, and eligibility is at or below poverty. So these are kids who are really in very vulnerable situations. So the idea that they have been pulled out of their regular face-to-face programming, when it first started in the spring and I knew they had missed weeks of programming, I was in panic. I can tell you now, I can't even describe how I'm feeling when I think about those children who have been out of that regular exposure to both instruction and structure and lots of other things. So I've got some information for you here, and I'm happy to entertain questions, so keep track of those as we go through. Next slide. I wanted to kind of go through with you, just in terms of Head Start, what was the impact, what have we done, what have we learned? I think you're going to see a lot of very similar impacts and maybe even similar responses in terms of Head Start and early education and K-12. We know that interacting with younger children usually requires closer contact. So there was a lot of thought initially about how do you put 2-year-olds in a room and tell them to social distance, for example, and with 3-year-olds keep a mask on, and changing diapers or cleaning up children after they eat. You get more exposed, I think, to children in general the younger they are. So some of those things are a little bit different, but similar experiences probably relate to staff and how you make staff feel comfortable and safe and confident. That's really important. And so we've done a lot around this. Initially, one of the first things we did right out of the gate, Head Starts are funded federal to local. So those programs who run Head Starts are getting those dollars directly from the federal government. And so we have direct impact on what happens in those cases. And initially, my biggest concern is that we would have 250,000 Head Start staff out of work if Head Start programs felt like they needed to shut their doors. There were two problems with that. The first was we didn't want the programs to stop serving the families and the children, even if they weren't face-to-face. And we also didn't want our folks to be unemployed in a struggling situation and possibly losing them, so that as we opened our doors, we'd end up having to re-recruit staff, which would put the programs at risk. So the first thing we did was we got approval to continue to pay staff regardless of how the services were being delivered. And Head Start isn't just preschool, it's also family services, things like food, nutrition, health, mental health, dental, the whole 9 yards. So there's a lot of comprehensive services that go with that. We gave folks flexibility in terms of how they spent their dollars and programmatically how they delivered services. So we saw some pretty creative things happen. And I know school systems did too. I was pretty plugged into both because we can learn from each other. Everything from, putting Wi-Fi on buses and parking them around the community so folks could tap into Wi-Fi, to coming up with unique ways of communicating with families to make sure that that communication loop was in place. Certainly food drop-offs, those were things that were initial concerns for us. A lot of our children, their best meals are when they're with us, and I'm sure that's true for the school systems as well. The communication piece was absolutely essential, and right out of the gate, we started doing some regular, pretty intensive webinars for really the whole early childhood field. So those could have been open to even to public school, pre-K folks, child cares, and then of course Head Start, and everything from CDC guidance on safety to instruction to mental health and stress issues. As many of you probably know, brain development is absolutely exponential, birth to 3, birth to 5. By the time a kiddo is 5 years old, 80 to 90% of that brain development is done. So when you're going through a very stressful situation as a young child, that impact on brain development is pretty significant. So doing a lot of work around that. And just for your information, all of those webinars, all of that information is free. It's on the eClick website. If you have access to a need for guidance around early childhood, please help yourself to those webinars and that information. We're happy to share it at the Office of Head Start. And then the things that I've learned, that we've learned as an office, one of the things I started doing around summertime was doing virtual site visits and going into centers and seeing how they were doing things, if they were doing face-to-face learning. One of the things we learned really early on was the value of the relationship with families. Head Start centers around parents and families. Head Start's mantra is a parent is a child's first and most important teacher, and that's true forever. I have to say, I come to this work from public school. I wouldn't say that was the mindset I had as a public school administrator. I never thought of it as the parent being my main access point, as it was more about what can we do as a school to serve the child. And this is a very different way of looking at things. And the way it became very apparent was as soon as everything stopped, there was really no problem with Head Start communicating with parents because they already had such a trusting relationship. They had immediate access. Those parents were saying, what's going to happen? How can we support? How can we get access to our services? What can we do to help our child continue literacy development? Those were the kinds of things that were happening because those relationships were strong to begin with. So we know those are so important. Families and their connectedness to a program aligns beautifully to what happens in a crisis like this. And then we also, of course, as a nation learned that health disparities, initial health disparities had a really big impact on how COVID was impacting folks who were contracting it. In Head Start, because our families are all living in poverty, their health disparities are significant. And so two things are true about that. The first is if COVID hits a community, a Head Start community, it's going to have a very significant impact health-wise on those folks. The second thing is because of that, the level of fear is astronomical. So trying to engage parents and get them back into face-to-face settings is much more difficult because of their fears. Next slide. I also want to make you aware of the PDG Birth to 5 and Transitions Report. As many of you may know, the PDG is the grant that centers around early childhood. Virginia has access to this. And this I have coming soon on here, but I think we actually published it yesterday, so I will get that link to you. There's a lot to learn in this report. What we did, the Office of Early Childhood Development, which I also direct, looked at every application for PDG dollars last year and analyzed what the states are doing based on their needs assessment. And from that, we believe all of the states can learn some best practices. So I encourage, if you're in this space, in your community, this can be a really good learning tool for you, and I'll provide that link to you all after this panel. Next slide. The other thing I wanted to talk about is when we're talking about the future of education, how does that link to early childhood, is this idea of transitions from early childhood into the public school system. As a public school person, when I came into this role, it became really apparent very quickly that there was a big disconnect between early childhood and the public schools. And even if I think about, I used to be an elementary administrator. I didn't do a whole lot in the early childhood space. I just waited till they got to me, and then I figured out, you know, where are you on the reading scale or whatever, and we set up programs and we individualized instruction. We did all those good things. But in retrospect, it might have been really smart if I were better aligned with the early childhood work so that when kiddos got to the school, we had some more cohesiveness. So I started working on that at a national level, and then really framed it around equity, because equity is something that we're all thinking about pretty intensely right now, and grappling with this idea. We know we're in this work for that purpose, but really reflecting on our work to see if we're fulfilling that promise. Next slide. I think there is a particular connection between transitions and equity, and this is kind of how I lay this out. This graphic, and there are others like this, that kind of show how we have addressed equality, equity, and justice. And, you know, we do things like prop up kids who might have a starting line that is further back from a typical child, for example. Sometimes we give them more supports to prop them up higher. And the idea is that true justice just takes the fence down so that there isn't this need to prop up, rather everybody has access. There's actual, I was doing this presentation in another group, and we started talking, and folks said, you know, what we ought to do is just tear the fence down, let them all go on the field and play together. And I thought that was a really interesting response. That maybe that's another level of this that we need to think about. But in terms of transitions, the way that I apply this is a kindergarten registration day, an orientation day where you invite the whole community might be an example of equality. Everyone's getting access to the school. That's not uniquely available to any particular group of students. And you're doing that before school starts to try to give them access so they feel more comfortable. Those are all really good things. Equity gets a little bit more meaty, and we look at things like having school liaisons that go from the school to the community, making home visits, getting to know our families where they live and appreciate that. Family outreach, programming for dual language learners, summer transition programs. Now we're getting closer to equity, because what we're trying to do in this scenario is to really, as the graphic shows, provide more levity where it's needed. But what I really think would be amazing is if we could get to this third column, which is really just a tear down of the system and rethinking how we do this all the way around. This isn't a little program that a school does. This is the system changing the way it thinks about this. It's coordinated enrollment in early childhood. Your community getting together with all of its early childhood access, and a parent applies one time and figures out where they're going to go, versus having all these disparate programs. It's data sharing from the early childhood space into the school system. It's aligning the curriculum so kids aren't learning how to do math in their pre-K class and then going into kindergarten, and it's a completely different curriculum. They're really starting over with the language they're using. Shared professional development with teachers is a great way to both support aligned curriculum and create really good relationships. And then a big one for me, and this is a big lesson from Head Start, is that we look at this idea that Head Start serves the whole family, and we carry that into the schools for families who need that. The idea that we don't just treat children, that we really look at their families and how we can embrace that, and by doing that, we create a more active learner. Next slide. So how do we take family engagement to the next level? Next slide. The Office of Early Childhood Development took this on. We took the Office of Head Start Parent, Family, and Community Engagement Framework, which is actually used in a number of different areas. I know CCSSO uses this. And we really focused on that family outcomes piece, that if we could start thinking of the fact that families are going to be the home base for a child well beyond their early childhood experience, and if we can build the family up and create a thriving environment, then that child is going to be better off long term. Next slide. And we call this radical family engagement at the Office of Early Childhood Development. We had a whole week on this last week where we got together with a number of different stakeholders and we said, what does this look like for schools? What does it look like for early childhood? What does this look like at the government level? What does this look like for parents? And how can we come together and create some unity around family engagement so that it isn't just an activity, it isn't just a math night, it isn't a back to school night. It's really changing the way we think about families and parents and their role in their child's education. And that's from birth up until, I don't know, they're finished being children in their families and they're more independent. Next slide. So what would this look like in public schools? The four identifiers on the left are the ones I talked about before: coordinating enrollment, data sharing, professional development, and aligned curriculum and comprehensive services, so that it goes from Head Start or early childhood all the way through to graduation. And we've got our Virginia Tech friend here. We know parents are still really involved with their kids even when they're in college. And even there, I would imagine he would say that family piece still is relevant, even if they're letting go more than they used to. The key family engagement efforts are things like changing the attitude from being more judgmental about how families live, which I think a lot of times we are, even without meaning to really welcoming families wherever they are. Wherever they are, they're welcome, judgment-free. Home visiting becomes a norm, not so that we can judge how kids are living, but so that we can go where parents are, get to know them on a personal level, and appreciate their existence and welcome them into the schools and create that tighter relationship. Schools consider family needs. Get to know them. Do you have a parent who lost a job and needs help with employment readiness? Whatever. We don't think of schools as being access to that, but the school is the hub in the community for all of our children and families, and we should take advantage of that. Parents feel empowered, and I love the definition of empowerment as being power with, not power over. So this is about bringing parents in and everybody feeling like they're on an equal footing. All ideas are considered. Everyone is an expert in a different way. And from that, you come up with really good plans that folks have full buy-in and you can really implement. Parents serve in real leadership positions. Policy Council is a part of Head Start, and it's a requirement by federal law. This Policy Council does things like hire staff, they pick curriculum, they look at the budget. These are parents who are living in poverty who are doing this. We're empowering those parents to get to know the system so they can appreciate it, and you get a lot of buy-in from that. And from that, you also get full 24-hour support for their child. And so what we see are children thriving. Participating in major decision-making. And this would be, you know, a little bit of a flip of the model that from what we tend to do now as a system. Next slide. The Office of Head Start sponsored a collaboration demonstration project where we worked with 13 school systems and kind of practiced this with them. We gave them the support. It was wildly successful. This is a link to that video. And Jeremy, I am going to forego showing this because I feel like I'm running long, but I will give the link to you so you can share it with folks. And if we end up not having questions, then maybe show it at the end. But what I don't want to do is step on my friend's time. So we can go to the next slide.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bergeron. And we do have a little bit of time built in at the end. So to your point, if there is time, we can
and if
do
not,
it.
you've got the link and you can share it with folks who came. I encourage you to watch it. It's really great. The big theme for me about Head Start and these other early childhood programs that really embrace families is I do think they are access to the American dream. This young man I met on one of my very first site visits, and he didn't speak English. We couldn't talk to each other, but he could play my guitar, and we had a really good interaction. I think about his start here at 3 years old. This is a migrant and seasonal Head Start program, so his parents are out in a field during the day, and he's getting exposure and a foundation that will change the trajectory of his life. And I really think Head Start is access to that. But more important than that, next slide, as we talk about communities, education is really access to the American dream. And when we decide to work together from early childhood up through college and create a trajectory that is more streamlined and more family-centered, I think that's where we really end up serving our children and our families most effectively. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bergeron. Really appreciate that excellent presentation, and I know you'll be sticking with us. And I know we also said we'll do Q&A at the end, but before we get too far ahead, we did receive a question in the chat from Ms. Peggy Kaiser asking if People Incorporated is a part of the Head Start program or separate. Also, if Kids Central is a part of the Head Start program.
So neither one of those are part of my office, which is the federal mechanism that funds Head Start. It is very plausible that they Head Starts run independently. So a Head Start program might engage with either one of those programs in order to supplement what they do. Head Start are never run as standalone. They're always partnering in the communities, and that's sort of how we build capacity.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Bergeron. So next up, for those of you who came in a little late and missed the introduction, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Keith Perrigan, who's Superintendent of Bristol, Virginia Public Schools, and also President of the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools of Virginia. So Dr. Bergeron, I will turn things over to you.
All right, Jeremy, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right, sounds good. Well, thanks everybody for joining in today, and I'm excited about the opportunity to share what my thoughts are about the future of education. It's hard to follow Dr. Bergeron there, but I'll do my best to provide some good information for you as we move forward. Obviously, as you can see from our first slide there, the photo of our students was taken well before COVID-19 hit. No students are wearing masks, and they're certainly not following the protocol of 6 feet of social distancing. But certainly we want to start out with where we started before COVID-19 as we talk about moving into the future of education. Just very quickly about Bristol, our school board has been dedicated to providing in-person instruction to our students from the very beginning. We opened school on August 20th, providing the opportunity for every family that wanted to choose in-person instruction to do so. And for those families who wanted to choose remote instruction, we made that opportunity available for them as well. And starting out, we had about 60% of our families who chose the in-person model, and we currently have, that number has increased to 75% of our families who have chosen to learn in person. An interesting statistic, and we're trying to be as transparent as we possibly can about the cases that we've experienced in our schools. A real interesting tidbit is that we have had over twice as many of our remote students test positive for COVID than we have our in-person students. And I really attribute that to our reopening team had a great plan, and our student, staff, families, and community have done a great job of following that plan. I really believe that for many of our students, we provide a safer environment for them than they could have if they don't have the structure of a normal school day. And so we're really excited about continuing to provide in-person instruction. You may be aware that Southwest Virginia, we kind of missed that first wave of COVID-19, but we're feeling it now. Our 7-day score for burden here in Bristol is approaching 50. And as you're probably aware that once it gets to about 10, that's kind of the red zone. So we're pretty hot here, but thankfully because of a great return to school plan, we're not feeling that inside of our schools, and we've not had to really close any classroom schools or anything like that. We do plan after Thanksgiving, because we know that there's going to be increases with the family gatherings. We are going to take a 4-day break after Thanksgiving to give that time to kind of settle in the community before we bring our students back to school. Jeremy, if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide, I'll get started. You know, the future of education, I think we're really going to have to be creative and rethink how we do everything. And that started very early on with us here in Bristol as we started to talk about what graduation was going to look like. And obviously during that time, back in May, when we were supposed to graduate, a traditional ceremony was not going to be possible. So we worked with a partner, Bristol Motor Speedway, to provide a graduation ceremony for our students. And we used the entire infield and the racetrack, and our families were able to drive in and park in the infield of Bristol Motor Speedway. And our students actually drove across the start-finish line to receive their diploma. And it was a great experience. You know, there was, you know, at that time in Southwest Virginia especially, folks, you know, really didn't understand why we needed to change the way that we were doing things. And we had some pushback initially when we decided to do graduation this way. But after it was all said and done, it was probably one of the most enjoyable graduation ceremonies that folks had experienced. And so I think I led with that, not necessarily to tell you about graduation in Bristol, but to tell you that because of COVID-19, there's a very unique opportunity for us now to rethink how we do everything. And just because we've done things a certain way in the past doesn't mean that's the best way. That just means that's the way we've done it. And I really appreciate, if there's anything that's good that's come out of COVID-19, it's an opportunity to rethink where we are and try to make the future of education better. Next slide, Jeremy. So as I said, you know, we really have an opportunity. I grew up with an Atari 2600 and often used the reset button if things weren't going the way that I wanted them to. And COVID-19 has provided an opportunity for us to hit the reset button. We can really redefine what public education looks like. And we're trying to be very proactive in Bristol, Virginia, and other parts of Southwest Virginia and across the coalition of small enrolled schools, because it's just a very unique opportunity that we're facing. But before we can redefine and reinvent education, we obviously have to deal with the issues that we're currently facing and provide a solid education during this pandemic. And there's a lot of things that contribute to that. Some of the major considerations that we're looking at is our board, and I know a lot of other school boards across the Commonwealth, are doing their very best to provide in-person learning opportunities when possible. You know, if we can't, we'll provide those remote opportunities, but we know that learning best occurs when students and teachers are in a classroom together. You know, when we can't provide those in-person learning opportunities, equitable access is certainly large on our mind. You know, we talk about equity a lot, and equity means a lot of things to a lot of different people. But I think that now, especially in rural Virginia, we're seeing that broadband is a huge equity access piece, and it's something that's going to take a lot of conversation and a lot of work in the future to provide equity, especially in small and rural school divisions. You know, you've probably heard from the superintendents in your school division or school board members in your area that there's a loss of enrollment, and that obviously state funding impact is directly related to school enrollment, and so that's something that we have to deal with. As I said earlier, broadband it's not just a technology issue, it's truly an equity issue. And, you know, we're really trying to rethink education, but what that all boils down to at the end of the day is making sure that we have adequate funding for public education. And I think that starts with a strong conversation about the state finally fully funding the standards of quality. Obviously, we have to meet those standards, and that is oftentimes we'll see the burden is placed upon the locality, either the city or the county, to provide the funding that's needed to meet the standards of quality. But I think now is a perfect opportunity for school boards and for boards of supervisors and for city councils to start having very frank conversations with our state legislators that now is the time to fully fund the standards of quality. Next slide, Jeremy. So as we talk about the future, we're living the future. We're reinventing education as we go. You've probably heard the analogy, we're building the plane as we're flying it. And I just wanted to share some of the things that we are experiencing as we try to provide in-person instruction during this pandemic. You know, we actually had to rezone some of our elementary schools because of larger enrollments at some schools and smaller enrollments at others, just to be able to accommodate the additional space that was needed for social distancing. We've also had to reduce our instructional day by 30 minutes because of transportation issues. We can only get 22 students on a bus. And so we actually have one bus run that has to make 3 runs because of the number of students that ride that bus. Because of that, bus duty is longer and teachers have to provide additional supervision. So we've actually had to reduce our instructional day by 30 minutes. We've even changed our school start times to accommodate. Obviously, social distancing is a big part of what we're doing. We have been able to maintain at 75% enrollment, 6 feet of social distancing in almost every classroom. We provide temperature checks as students arrive at school or before they get on our school bus. We do require masks in all of our buildings, but we do provide mask breaks for our students. And we do provide water bottles because we're trying to keep students away from the water fountains, which if you've been to a public school, you know there are plenty of germs around a water fountain. We have isolation rooms in each of our schools in case a student does start to provide symptoms. And I mentioned earlier, it's a huge transportation impact because of the limited number of seats that we can fill on our buses. Next slide there, please, Jeremy. We're not eating lunch in our cafeteria. Students go to pick up their tray and they come back and eat lunch in their classrooms. One thing that's been a big shift for all of us, we always stress the importance of good attendance, and it's not just from our students, but from our staff as well. But we are really having to rethink about how we look at attendance because we certainly don't want a student or a staff member coming to school and causing us to have transmission in our schools. The amount of money that we're spending on cleaning has been phenomenal. Thankfully, there's been some CARES Act funding that has offset that, but we're working harder than we ever have to make sure that our schools are clean. And we also providing PPE in our car rider lines at some of our elementary schools as we're doing temperature checks. It's just strange to drive by and see our employees wearing gowns and masks and gloves as they're reaching their hands into students' cars to take those temperatures. I mentioned earlier with lunchrooms, we are reducing access to communal areas, trying to keep groups small. And we've also reduced mass transitions. We're being very creative about how students go from class to class at our middle and high school to make sure that our halls are not full. As you may have seen in some of those Georgia school divisions that opened very early where they had some spread. So obviously we are in the process of reinventing education as we're living. Next slide, please, Jeremy. But I also mentioned enrollment laws. You've probably heard some discussion at the state budget about holding school divisions harmless as far as enrollment goes. If you look across the state, enrollment is down in public schools across the state by 36,000 students. Actually, our coalition was founded on this very issue. Before coming to Bristol, I was superintendent in Norton City, which, as you're probably aware, is right in the heart of the coal country in Southwest Virginia. And back in 2016, when we came back, several coal companies had closed and enrollment was down about 11% across Southwest Virginia. I noticed that Ron Peters from Dickinson County is in on the call, and I think he was in the original meeting when our coalition was formed based on this issue. And so we've been talking about enrollment loss for some time in rural school divisions, but I think other localities across the Commonwealth really see what the impact of enrollment loss is. In 2008, before the recession, that was an annual part of the state budget that school divisions were held harmless if they had unexpected enrollment loss. I think everybody's feeling that now. And so as you advocate with state legislators, I hope that you will talk about enrollment loss because it's now not just a rural issue. It's also a suburban and an urban issue. There is a potential to lose $150 million in school revenue statewide because of that decrease in enrollment. If you've not been told by a local school board member, it is certainly not cheaper to provide education in a pandemic. So our costs are not going down, even though our enrollments may be. And if the state doesn't provide this hold harmless, I think you know where the additional funding will have to come from, and that'll be from localities. So I think this is a topic that school boards and boards of supervisors can work together on as we go into this next legislative session, not just to provide us harmless during the current fiscal year, but also as the state budget is being developed for the next year, we need to bring enrollment laws and make that part of the state budget process moving forward. If you look also at the picture on this slide, the Coalition of Small and Rural Schools of Virginia represents 75 school divisions across the Commonwealth. If you don't see your particular county highlighted on that map or think that your school division ought to be a member of this coalition, which actually helps us have a better and stronger voice in Richmond, be sure to have them contact me, and we'll do what needs to happen to make sure that they're a member of our coalition. I would also challenge boards of supervisors, if you don't have something similar, it's very hard for a small locality like Bristol, Norton, or even Dickinson County to have much of a presence in Richmond. But when we bring our voices together, it certainly helps us to advocate for the needs of our rural communities. So I would challenge you to think about putting together a coalition like this at the board of supervisor level. Next slide, Jeremy. Broadband access is going to be a huge point of emphasis for our coalition as we advocate in the future. We've talked about the homework gap before and how it affects folks who don't have access to broadband because it's not there or because they can't afford it. What we found because of COVID-19 is that it's not really a gap, it's a canyon. So many of our families, and if you're from a rural area or a high poverty area, you're probably seeing this and experiencing this. But according to the governor's office, 350,000 families in Virginia currently do not have access to broadband. That's something that we cannot, as we move forward in education, the future is going to include some remote learning opportunities regardless of what happens with the pandemic, and broadband has to be part of that solution. It's you see the photo there, that's a solar hotspot in Louisa County. Other school divisions are providing hotspots in church parking lots, or they're providing personal hotspots for families, or families are having to drive to the school to pick up thumb drives to get their instruction for the next week. That's what schools are doing now, but this is not just a school issue. This is an economic development issue. This is a real estate issue. This is selling homes in your community issue. It's something that school boards and boards of supervisors really need to work together to advocate on. We've got to improve broadband access in our Commonwealth. Next slide, please. And we also know that now that parents have a taste of remote learning, that even when the pandemic is gone, which we don't anticipate that it'll be gone even by next fall, we'll still be waiting for the vaccine to have its full effect. So we know that remote learning is going to be a part of what we do every single day. So in Southwest Virginia, we're actually coming together to talk about providing a regional virtual academy. There are currently 15,000 students in Southwest Virginia, which is about 30% of our student population who are choosing to be remote learners currently. So what we want to do in Bristol, our teachers are providing instruction both in person and remotely, and they can't continue at that pace. So we're trying to create this academy to lighten our teachers' load so that they only have to teach in one model. We also, there's some hard to staff areas especially in small communities, to get, say, a physics or a calculus teacher. By providing a regional academy, we think we can alleviate some of that. There's also, you may or not be familiar that there are some online companies that are sanctioned by the VDOE, and they come into school divisions and they will provide online learning opportunities, and they will give 5% of state enrollment back to the localities and keep 95% of it. Currently, there are 13,000 students that are enrolled in that virtual academy, and it's sucking money out of local school divisions. And so if we don't provide a solution in public education, somebody's going to provide it for us. And so I hope that you'll work very closely with your local school boards to support future virtual learning academies, whether it be a regional basis or a local basis. Code RVA is kind of a model. I'm sorry, Jeremy, going back to that. Code RVA is an in-person model of what a regional school can look like. And so we're trying to develop a virtual model of that. And if you're from Southwest Virginia and are interested in learning more, talk to the superintendent in your school division. We're having a planning session about hours on November the 19th. It'll be via Zoom, so you can learn more about that. Finally, Jeremy, the last slide, I hope I got us on, keep us on track there. You know, our jobs, and I'm sure yours, changes on a daily basis. Almost everything that we're dealing with today is related to COVID, but it's also related to reinventing education. Pandora's box has been opened in relation to remote learning, and we're not going to be able to shove it back in there. We have to do everything that we possibly can to make sure that public schools are positioned to provide remote learning opportunities for our students, because if we don't, somebody will. And doesn't take a scientist or a mathematician to figure out what will happen if we continue to lose students the way that we have in the first part of COVID-19. So with that, Jeremy, that is my the conclusion of my presentation. Happy to answer any questions at the end.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Perrigan. As always, a very enlightened presentation and a good overview of some of the challenges that our school divisions are facing. And I particularly enjoyed your slides on enrollment laws. I know that was a big priority for VACo this session, was making sure that we were held harmless at least until the next General Assembly meets, and certainly appreciate the work that all of your members do, as well as ours, on that issue. We did have a comment in the chat, an observation from Mr. Ronald Peters, that a person's choice to send a potentially exposed child to school gets complicated with childcare or work impact. And Dr. Perrigan, I don't know if you were on our last presentation, but we had Stephen Murray from VDEP on talking about the impact of not having childcare on terms of getting back to work and COVID recovery. So I don't know if you have any thoughts for Mr. Peters' comment on the difficulties that some of the parents in your division are facing and making those difficult choices.
Well, you know, Jeremy, that was one of the reasons. We had several reasons. You know, as we decided about returning to school, we had to balance risk. We knew there was a health risk associated with COVID-19, but there was a plethora of other risks that you had to consider as well. Childcare for working families was one of those that we considered, and by providing in-person learning opportunities, we alleviated that. We also, though, for our families that still choose remote, we have partnerships with Boys and Girls Club, Girls Inc., and other community agencies. United Way in Southwest Virginia is providing some of those. So I think it's about partnerships and certainly just recognizing the fact that even though our job is not to provide child care as a public school system, certainly some parents use that as their child care so they can, you know, make a living. And so one of the reasons that we've started in-person environment and continue in that path is because we want to support working families in our community.
Thank you, Dr. Perrigan. And this, I believe, was covered in the slide, but we have one more question. I don't want to intrude too much on Mr. Owczarski's time, but we do have one question from Ms. Linda Kukenbuch to everyone. What is the total percentage of lost enrollment statewide? And I believe you said the fiscal impact, I know, is $150 million estimated, but do we have the figure in terms of number of students?
The number of students, I think the number of students is 36,000. I don't know what that percentage is. I'm sorry. If you can go back, let's see that slide. The number is 36,000 students statewide. I don't know what that percentage is. It's a small percentage, but if you're in a small or rural school division, it only takes 10 or 20 students drop in enrollment to have a huge impact on the budget. And the problem, the way Virginia creates its budget, we send contracts to teachers before the state budget is even approved. And we pay enrollment based on what happens the next year instead of what happens the previous year. And so once teachers are hired, they're hired. And so even if you do have decline in enrollment, you have at least 1 year where you have the increased cost, but the reduced revenues.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so we're going to move on. Next, we have, and thank you, Dr. Perrigan, for a great presentation. I know you'll be staying with us to the end in case there are more questions. But next, for those of you who missed the intro, we are very fortunate to be joined by Mr. Mark Owczarski, who is the Assistant Vice President of University Relations at Virginia Tech. And Mr. Owczarski, I will turn things over to you. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate that. And thank you to Deborah and to Keith. You know, it's amazing to me listening to their presentations, how many parallel issues, thoughts, conversations, whether that be preschool, whether that be K through 12, so much, there's so many parallels and overlaps. When Deborah was talking about communication, the role of parents, the continuum of learning, and Keith talking about everything from making classes physically distant and all of the cleaning and the work and all of the issues related to getting students to and fro and worrying about your workforce and all that kind of good stuff. All those issues have been felt and experienced by a place like Virginia Tech. And I'll touch on some of these things. So I think I will keep us on track. So Jeremy, next slide to get us going. But just to kind of set the stage a little bit, you know, when all of this started, which perhaps might seem like an eternity ago, it was interesting because I was actually traveling to Florida, taking a couple of spring training baseball games in early February. And when sort of the news and the emergence of COVID-19 in Asia and in Europe, and it all began for Virginia Tech as a study abroad issue. We were deeply concerned that our students were in harm's way, not just our students, actually, our scholars as well as our teachers that were abroad. And so we rapidly had to move to figure out what was the safest thing to do for our students who were located all over the globe, whether that be Japan, Korea, China, all throughout Europe, and points elsewhere. And so I remember being in Florida at a friend's house while my wife and our friends were having dinner, and I was getting my laptop open, which I had thought to bring, and I was doing virtual work in much the same way that we're doing virtual work today. We just didn't call it a Zoom or a WebEx. We just called it, you know, flipping your laptop on and hopping onto the internet and doing all of that. But for Virginia Tech, our entree into all of this was looking at a global issue in terms of the safety of our students and scholars. And it rapidly changed very quickly, obviously, as COVID began to approach the United States. And within a matter of weeks, and it was late February, where we decided that we would take our traditional spring break, the first week of March, extend it a week, and then we were going to shift everything that we do to be online. And that was, we had to do it all in 2 weeks. It was a quick Herculean process. It required the heavy lift of so many people, the understanding of so many people, students, parents, employees, and all of that. And within 2 weeks, we returned from an extended spring break. And from mid-March, really all the way till school started again in August, we did everything online. And so that was a quick pivot that we had to do. It was done quickly and with urgency. And it probably wasn't the neatest process in the world, but like all schools and like all public organizations and businesses, we simply had to react because at the early stages, and again, go back to our mindset of February and March of this year, we had no idea what we were in for. We had no idea what COVID would do to our communities, to our organizations. We had no idea how long this would last. We still don't. And so we're in the midst of this new normal that we're in, and we're making decisions as we go along the way. So just to kind of reset our clocks a little bit, you know, back then we moved quickly. We moved with a sense of great urgency for the safety of all of this, of our communities, and we, you know, transitioned our campus of, again, a campus of 35,000 undergraduate and graduate students, roughly 9,000 employees, overnight to a situation we were operating with essential operations and moving everything online. Next slide, Jeremy. So again, in the early phases, just to kind of recap, all of our instruction, all of our events moved online. I appreciated Keith's story about a different kind of commencement. It's kind of funny because we kind of had to flip it in a different way. We traditionally meet at the big Lane Stadium and have 5,000 graduates on our field, tossing their caps and tassels up in the air And we actually had to move to a completely digital experience because our students were all home, and we needed to acknowledge and recognize this incredibly important milestone in our students' lives. And we did it all in an online format. And that was something that was unknown and unheard of. It was just really remarkable. But not just that, it was things like homecoming online, parents' weekend online, and all of those traditional events moving into a virtual format. We also, as an organization, shifted to telework. More than 80% of our employees moved home. As you can see, I'm in my dining room, still working from home primarily, do go to campus on occasion, but still Virginia Tech made this massive change to doing a telework shift. Like Deborah had mentioned earlier, a massive communications effort ensued starting in March. We launched what we call our Ready website, which was initially our COVID website. We brought all of our messages and mediums to a central location. It was our COVID-19 website that emerged into what we called our Ready website as we were getting ready for the fall. And now the word ready for a website doesn't seem quite right. And so we're probably going to have to evolve in our communications in terms of how we present information as we go into this next phase or new normal or whatever you want to call it. But that communications had to touch our employees, our students, our parents and families, our alumni, anybody who had a connection to Virginia Tech. And so we had to consider all of that, just like in preschool education, K through 12 and all of that. And we did all of this, and we made all the decisions that Virginia Tech made. And I'm sure I probably speak for Keith and Deborah as well, as we did it with the rudder and the guidance of preserving public health, recognizing that there were many in the community who were at greater risk. As we've now been in COVID for almost 10 months, we recognize the impact of the virus on young people versus old people and people with medical ailments and things like that. And so all of that had to be balanced with a college community and cohort. Recognizing that 18 to 22-year-old students were sharing classroom spaces with faculty members or instructors who may be in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, or beyond, maybe dealing with other health issues or crises, had to find that right balance while we maintained our operations. And again, Virginia Tech, not just about instruction, but we have three primary missions of teaching, research, and engagement. Engagement meaning outreach to throughout the Commonwealth as the land-grant university. We think of cooperative extension, our presence in every county. I think about, Keith was talking about the broadband effort, and that's something that Virginia Tech plays a great role in working to improve broadband access through South and Southwest Virginia. So there's so many functions and operations of the university that we had to transition to, and we did so, all of that online. Jeremy, next slide. So as we kind of concluded our spring semester, we then transitioned into the summer months, and really we embarked on a massive planning effort. And again, I know K through 12 school districts were doing the same thing, and everybody was doing what was the fall going to look like. And so we had several large planning efforts to do that. We announced our initial plan on June 8th because we knew in order for these plans to get going, we had to give people time to implement them, and recognizing we were again blazing new trails. So while we announced our plan on June 8th, I can assure you and tell you that we had to make many pivots, many revisions along the way. We've been doing that constantly since March, right down to today, to adapt to the new situations that we're dealing with spikes or with outbreaks or with hotspots, or as our public health information changes and emerges around testing, about physical distancing, about all the things that we need to know about COVID. But one of the things that I just wanted to touch on perhaps a bit longer than normal was the work that we did in collaboration with various partners. Jeremy, next slide. I want to take a moment and talk about the New River Valley COVID Task Force. This was a group that came together in the March, April, May timeframe, It was led by the chief of police in the town of Blacksburg and our New River Valley Health District Health Director, Dr. Noel Bissell, and Chief Anthony Wilson, two incredible leaders who pulled together a whole wide variety of partners, including our K through 12 school districts, our higher education institutions. Keep in mind that the New River Valley area, our primary industry is higher education. When you consider the 30 to 35,000 students in Blacksburg, and you consider the approximately 20,000 students coming at Radford University, when we are fully residential in operation, we almost double the size of our community. And so our greatest industry is higher education. But we also brought together first responders, mental health and healthcare providers, government officials, business organizations, and business leaders to work together at a coordinated response. Because as our previous speakers talked about, everything has a ripple effect. Because, for example, the parents of the students going to the K through 12 schools that Keith talked about are our employees, our 7,000 or 8,000, 9,000 employees at Virginia Tech. So the impact of what we do will impact so many different areas. So it's very important to consider how all of these affected one another. And it's also important to know that as a mostly rural area out here, our healthcare systems were essential to consider and to manage. We're served primarily through Carilion Clinic and HCA or Lewis Gale. And, how would the pandemic, again, think back to the early days, how could outbreaks and cases be affected, and how would patients be dealt with? How would bringing in an additional 40 to 50,000 college students into our community place a burden on those systems? And so Virginia Tech, while you might think we could work in our own little bubble and solve all of our needs and issues, we could not. And I don't think any organization or any school system or business organization or anything can work in that bubble alone. And so those community partnerships, the collaborations are essential to make sure that everybody knows what everybody's doing and that we stay informed. This task force initially met every morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. We're now meeting 3 times a week, and we continuously talk about issues, trying to project, looking forward. It's so important. One of the things I just wanted to touch about was our Be Well, Be Committed campaign, and I'll don this mask briefly and momentarily about this, because through this community partnership, we were able to pool our resources, pool our talents, and through CARES Act funding, be able to purchase 100,000 of these masks for our community. When I think about the early days of April, May, June, July, and August, you really didn't see a whole lot of people within our community wearing the masks. We didn't quite have that spike that Keith was talking about before. And there was a great concern that college students would bring the virus to our community. And so through the task force, we were able to bring resources together. The Be Committed, Be Well campaign was initially thought of as a campaign to keep our residential students at Virginia Tech safe and secure as they were signing housing contracts, to show respect for their roommates, to work collaboratively. And we quickly realized as the task force came together and said, we really need to start educating our community about the simple truths of wear a mask, stay physically distant, wash your hands, and now we added get a flu shot. And so we took and leveraged this campaign, the Be Well, Be Committed campaign, and we applied it to the entire community. And we see now advertising on our public, newspaper websites and things like that. We see so many community efforts that span from infants and toddlers through K through 12, through businesses and local governance, this united community effort to be committed and to be well. I think that's one of the great outcomes of this task force. No one organization could have done it well by itself. It wouldn't have had the impact, but by partnering and staying in close contact. These are the things we can do as a community together. And so I think one of the highlights of all of this is that campaign and how it's elevated the education and the awareness of what people must do to keep our community safe. Next slide, Jeremy. So as we approach August, September, and October, our fall semester, this is where we kind of landed. And again, so much, I think, of this echoes what Keith has talked about in terms of the mix and the blends and all that stuff. We had a bit more time to think about the fall, of course, between March and August, and to get it better and to improve on the rapid transition we did in late February and early March. But where we stand right now is our instruction at Virginia Tech looks like 6% in person, a 30% a hybrid dual model where you meet both in person and online, and 64% that is wholly online. This fall, 45% of our workforce returned to campus, meaning 55% of our workforce still is working primarily in a telework sort of arrangement. Our housing capacity, for example, is at approximately 80%. Much of that is very intentional. We wanted to clear, for example, and these were conversations having with local health officials and local folks, the need to have isolation space in our residence halls should our students get sick and should our students contract COVID-19. So we've kept empty rooms for that reason. We've never reached capacity, thank goodness, but we have it should situations change. It was part of our response in terms of making sure we could contribute to the overall community wellness of making sure that if people did come down with COVID, our students, that we would have safe places where they could isolate, where they could be fed, where they could be safe and secured, be monitored by our doctors at our Shifford Health Center, and be in support of the broader community effort. Again, it's interesting that our public health guidelines, wearing a mask, washing your hands, staying physically distant, became part of policy. Employees and students are required to follow those. They can face disciplinary action, but we tend not to stress on that, and we tend to focus on the educational efforts around raising awareness of the things that each and every one of us can do to keep the community safe. And over the course of the spring semester, it's become more abundantly clear to us the role that testing can play in terms of monitoring your community's health and keeping your community health to have earlier detection of COVID so that you don't transmit the disease. Virginia Tech is very fortunate to have in Roanoke the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute, and much of the testing, in fact, all of the testing we do for our students and employees is done there. We don't outsource it. And we also have capacity to provide testing capabilities for the New River Valley region. So it gives us greater flexibility, gives us greater speed in terms of assessing community health. It's, I guess, the advantage of being a research university and having these facilities. But again, it required our faculty and our researchers to adapt very quickly to the need and providing that service. Next slide. So in terms of lessons learning, and that's actually not intentionally poor grammar, it's sort of stressing the current and active tense of learning and looking ahead. But some of the things that we have learned or experienced through all of this is that students still seek that residential college experience. Higher education, no doubt, will change, as Keith was talking about, inventing education as we go. But that residential experience is something that remains, that we have seen deeply valued and deeply sought after by our students and also by our families. So the notion of everything going online forever perhaps is probably a bit extreme or overdramatic, but it's something that our students seek. Virginia Tech, at least I can speak for, experiential learning requires that in-person learning experience. When you think about engineers in labs and architects in studios and students who study abroad, agriculture and natural resources students doing field work at farms or in forests, the hands-on research opportunities and the living learning centers we do, all of those require physical presence. And Keith said it best, it requires student-teacher interaction. And while Zooming has been immediately thrust upon us all, it can create an incredible amount of opportunities for learning, particularly as it relates to pace to degree and receiving your degree. So for example, if a student studies abroad for a semester, they could be and we've kind of known this, but we've never really experienced it, could Zoom in for a class back in Blacksburg to continue their coursework towards graduation, even though they may not be physically present. Myriad of possibilities. And Jeremy, the last slide. And then also key lessons learned, and again, I think all of this was touched on, that agility in all of this, being able to pivot, being able to take advantage of either opportunity or responding to a crisis accurately is essential for any organization to remain agile and continue on. Teleworking has clearly arrived within higher education. And again, it speaks to the issues of childcare and all of the issues that employees must face as they're trying to strike that work-life balance. Can't underscore enough the incredible importance of strong community, regional, state relationships that must be well in place before these things happen so that you can leverage them to find your way through such situations. And really what we're finding that Virginia Tech is doing right now is we're currently building our path to what the world will look like once the magical vaccine comes to us and the fear of the virus is behind us. So we're building that as we go, and it's an active process that is far from complete, and we have no idea when the timeline will be for that. So that's it in terms of my remarks. I'm sorry if I went a little over, but if anybody has some questions, Jeremy, I see some things in the chat. You can perhaps organize them.
Yes, and thank you, Mark, for a great overview of everything that Tech's been doing and the impact of COVID and looking ahead. We do have some, and we are on time. We have some built-in flexible time between this and our next session at 1. But we do have a couple of comments in the chat, as you said. One from Dr. Bergeron, who said, as a Virginia Tech parent, I thought having an isolation dorm was so smart, kept the students there, not sending them back to their communities, and allow them to recover and get back to their jobs as students. Really forward thinking. And then we also have a question from Ms. Selma Hood. It's directed to you and Keith, but I would also invite Dr. Bergeron to maybe address the impact of this to childcare providers as well. But Ms. Hood asks, how will our new normal affect campus living by K-12 and higher education students and faculty in Virginia? And I Mark or Keith, if you want to start us off, or Dr. Bergeron.
Jeremy, could you repeat the question?
Yes, sir. Ms. Hood asks, how will our new normal affect campus living by K-12 and higher education students and faculty in Virginia?
So in K-12, we don't have anybody staying on campus. Our focus is going to continue until we have a major impact on our schools and our ability to function in our current environment. Continue to provide as safe an environment as we possibly can to make sure that families have choices. So far our plan has worked, and we'll continue to follow that plan until it doesn't.
And I think to answer that question, again, it's interesting because the residential experience, the totality of it, including everything from traditional lecture halls to experiential learning, and that's a fancy highfalutin term to basically say all the things that are things like laboratories or field work or study abroad, and all the things that help you explore the world and learn in creative learning environments, as well as meeting friends and experiencing people from other parts of the state, nation, and around the world. It's about football game weekends and tailgating, all of which tailgating, of course, is suspended right now in the town of Blacksburg, and our football games are being played to empty stadiums other than the players on the field. So, people have been very clear to us is that they seek that, because higher education is not just classroom instruction, but it begins to diversify itself through exposure to people, exposure to new ideas, learning opportunities that are perhaps outside of traditional four walls and desks and lecture halls and things like that, where at a place like Virginia Tech, again, we have farms for our agricultural students. We have forests available throughout the state for our natural resources and students. Our architects are in studios, not in traditional classrooms. Our engineers are building submarines. They're building bridges. They're building cars. They're building robots. Again, in non-traditional sorts of things that you think about with lectures and things like that. And then you get into all the labs, the biology, the chemistry, and things like that. All of that is essential to learning. And so I don't think the days of the residential campus are going to go away, and you don't need college campuses anymore, because I think students are very clear, and faculty are reminding us that there are so many different kinds of learning experiences. But I do think that some of the lessons learned will create even more opportunities down the road when properly harnessed and balanced between delivering something remote as well as being in person.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of that's
Mark,
ahead of us.
I think that is so spot on. The question, even though it's talking about, campus living, what Mark was saying about, it's that experience that's part of the whole college experience overall. We have the same thing in K-12 and early ed. So in K-12, it's, learning to get along with a lot of different kind of people and different teachers as you switch classrooms or whatever those things are that aren't happening now, that children are literally not having those experiences. In early education, it's, as simple as, learning to sit on the carpet for a whole 10 minutes before you feel like you have to move, and how do I control my body, and how do I tell someone what I need without, hitting them, or whatever the little things are that we're teaching children. Those are things that literally aren't happening. So while we see the awesome opportunity technology has offered us, I mean, this conference is an example of that. I'm sure there are people here who might not have been able to come if they had to actually travel and go away and stay in a hotel. So we get a chance to connect more readily. There is this other piece that we want to be really cautious of, that we don't overcorrect and not remember that that's also a big part of just human development. And it's equally as important as content. Interestingly enough, Mark, and this is just my own anecdotal experience, my daughter, who's a second year at Tech, has now readjusted her academic plan, and she's going to graduate in 3 years. And I think it's because it's not enough to keep her there. Like, she's getting through her classwork. That's not really a big deal. And she's trying to do other things, but she's not having that holistic college experience where she's thinking, I want to do this for 4 years. So I think what you said about pacing is really interesting. And I think high schools are probably going to learn some of this. I used to be a high school administrator, and when my school system shifted to a one-to-one school system. So this technology was not new to that school system. We adopted online learning and the flipped classroom and all of that. And what I was able to do with kids who I could tell didn't have the stamina for 4 years of high school is to put them on an online plan that, number one, helped them get through the day more readily, because they couldn't sit in a classroom with a bunch of kids all day long. They just didn't have that capacity. And they could see their success more readily, because online, it tends to work at the pace of the child. As a student, they could feel, oh, I did that, well, I can do one more. Whereas a classroom tends to move at a classroom pace. It's harder to get that individual accomplishment on a regular basis. So it was very motivating for teenagers who were struggling. So I think that I love what you said about, just finding that balance of what can we learn and really capitalize on, but also not believe that we've entered this new normal that's going to look so incredibly different, because we are still human beings and we still like to be with each other and interact, and we get a lot out of that, and not to lose sight of how important that is. And as lovely as it is to be able to be here, this is not the same as if we were all in a room together and have the opportunity to really exchange. It's different. So it's really, really good question.
Yes, and thank you to all of you who provided some really good answers. Just continuing on that theme, we are getting some additional questions from members in the chat and also via email, but this is from Mr. Jerry Booth in Floyd County. While in-person learning is the preference, could we see the continuation of virtual learning being an option for school systems when we get through the pandemic in general, or as an option instead of expulsion? And Dr. Perrigan, I don't know if you want to take that one, but I'll also add that Mr. Ronald Peters added in the chat in response to the comments that were made, that your teaching staff have the flexibility to switch to virtual if there's a crisis in their home.
Jeremy, so I'll answer both those questions and leave time for others to chime in as well. We actually, the Regional Virtual Academy that I mentioned is an answer for the first part of that. We know that Pandora's box has been opened and that some families will really thrive in a virtual environment. We know that other students may gravitate towards virtual learning rather than dropping out if we make that option available to them. And so I think that school divisions really need to be proactive right now and create the future instead of having it created for them by private industry. And so we're going to work really hard to make those options available in coming years, whether we're living in a pandemic or not. And then to answer the second question about our staff, we do provide remote teaching opportunities for our families. Some jobs, you can't drive a bus from home. So those employees, don't have that option. But for our staff that can, we do have actually some teachers who are teaching their classes from home because of health concerns that they have. And we've just had to use some additional local funding or CARES Act funding to provide a supervisor in those in-person classrooms to monitor students while the teacher teaches from home. So we've tried to be flexible, not just with our students, but with our staff as well.
Yeah, I think all we've done is we were required to try some new tools and try some new experiences that, without the impetus of change in a crisis, we may not have been so quick to test or whatever. And I think, when you look at higher education, you can imagine, for example, a student coming to Blacksburg, engaging in really unique and impactful experiential opportunities through service, through labs and all that stuff. They could conceivably take a course from a faculty member in Beijing or the Philippines or London or at Michigan or Stanford, who would be the expert in the field that they really want to go into and pursue. The opportunity for students to customize their education is almost limitless. That opportunity is there. Same thing with, research collaborations. We're talking a lot about classroom, but Virginia Tech is a very large research enterprise. You could bring researchers from all across the world on a Zoom to solve the world's most challenging problems and questions. So, there is a silver lining to all of this, and it really challenges us as educators, as researchers, as civil servants to the Commonwealth of how we do our business moving forward. I don't think we have arrived at what that is. I think we constantly evolve and change, but we're learning a lot and we're applying things. And one of the things that Virginia Tech is trying to do, and my function rests primarily within communications, is to begin to share the stories from the fall semester of how, for example, you teach theater online. How do you teach a laboratory, virtually? I'm the parent of two middle schoolers, a 6th and an 8th grader. I've watched my son learn to play the guitar online, but I've also seen, for example, opportunities lost, like my daughter not being able to be on a swim team or participating in the yearbook. So there's challenges in both ways. And so really what the future will look like is going to be that blend and that hybrid of all of the above probably in a format that is more tailored and customized to the student, or in Virginia Tech's case, the student, the researcher, the employee, being able to balance work-life issues and delivering of work and all of the many things that we do. So sky's the limit. There is hope and optimism. But I think we still are in the midst of something we don't know how long it's going to last, and we continue to figure out what we're building as we go through it.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate that. We are getting a few more comments, but I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. And first of all, just say a huge thank you to Mr. Owczarski, Dr. Perrigan, and Dr. Bergeron for a really insightful conversation and for answering these questions.